If you were to unfold a geological survey map of Pike County, Kentucky, dated from the late 1990s, your finger might trace the jagged spine of the eastern border until it hesitated over a dense, crosshatched section of forestry known as Blackwood Ridge. For generations, this specific cluster of peaks was treated as a dead zone. Hunters didn't run their dogs there. Before we begin, I encourage you to share in the comments where you're watching from and what time you're experiencing this account. We're curious to know how far these documented events reach across time zones and continents. Timber companies, usually so eager to strip the Appalachian wealth from the land, often bypassed it for less difficult terrain. The locals said it was because the slopes were too steep, the rock too slate-heavy to hold a foundation. But the old families, the ones who had been in those hills since the Civil War, knew that the geography wasn't the problem. The problem was the memory. The problem was the history that had soaked into the groundwater a century ago. In the wet, thawing spring of 2003, a man named Robert Miller walked into that silence. Miller was a private contractor, a land surveyor hired by a speculative mining firm to re-evaluate the boundaries of the state forest. He was a man of science, of trigonometry and elevation levels, a man who trusted his expensive theodolite more than he trusted his own eyes. He had spent 20 years bushwhacking through the rhododendron hells of Kentucky and West Virginia. He thought he knew the woods. He thought he knew what silence sounded like. But Blackwood Ridge was different. Miller later described the ascent in a deposition that was never made public. He talked about the way the sound dropped out of the world the higher he climbed. The wind didn't rustle the leaves, it just pressed against them. The birds didn't sing, they watched. On the afternoon of his third day, pushing through a thicket of briars that tore at his canvas jacket, Miller stumbled into a clearing that felt artificially flat. The forest had tried its best to reclaim it. 100-year-old oaks twisted their roots over mounds of earth, and ivy choked the ground in a thick, green carpet. But beneath the overgrowth, the shape of human intention was still visible. It was a foundation. Massive, river-stone blocks, hauled up the mountain by mule and human back, laid with a precision that defied the wildness of the surroundings. Miller wiped the sweat from his eyes and checked his maps. There was nothing here. No homestead claim, no tax record, no deed. According to the state of Kentucky, no human being had ever lived on this coordinate. But as Miller kicked at a pile of rotting timber, the wood crumbled away to reveal iron, a heavy, rusted hinge, and beneath it, the black, gaping mouth of a cellar that had been swallowed by the earth. Curiosity is a dangerous instinct in the wild. Miller knelt in the mud, pulling out his flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a space that had been sealed like a time capsule. The air that drifted up was cold, smelling of wet stone and something sweet, like dried flowers and old decay. He saw shelves lined with glass jars, their contents long since turned to black sludge. He saw a rusted kerosene lantern, the glass chimney shattered inward. And then, half buried in the dirt floor, he saw the bundle. He reached down, his gloves slick with mud, and pulled out 3 leather-bound books wrapped tightly in oilcloth. They were heavy, swollen with moisture. Beneath them lay a child's doll. It was carved from solid oak, heavy and primitive. But it was the face of the doll that made Miller drop his flashlight. The eyes and mouth hadn't been painted on, they had been burned off. Someone had taken a hot poker and methodically pressed it into the wood, erasing the features, leaving only charred, black craters where a face should be. Miller didn't know it then, but he was holding the only surviving image of what Margaret Vance believed a child should look like. Empty, clean, faceless. Miller left the equipment. He left the expensive tripod standing in the mud. He took the journals and the doll, and he walked 5 miles down the mountain without stopping for water. He later said that he felt a pressure between his shoulder blades the entire way, a sensation of being escorted off the property by something he couldn't see. When he handed the items over to the County Historical Society days later, his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't sign the donation paperwork. To understand why a rational man would flee a pile of rocks, we have to wind the clock back. We have to leave 2003 and descend into the grey, hard winter of 1919. The foundation wasn't a ruin then. It was a fortress. It was the home of the Vance family. Elias Vance was a good man, by all accounts. He was a coal miner with a back made of iron and a laugh that could rattle the window panes. He had built the cabin on Blackwood Ridge with his own hands, wanting to give his wife, Margaret, a view of the sunrise. They had 5 sons. The house was full of noise, of boots on floorboards, of boys wrestling in the yard, of Margaret shouting for them to wash up for supper. It was a hard life, but it was a loud, living life. Then came the rain. In the spring of 1919, the sky opened up and didn't close for 4 days. The big sandy river, usually a lazy snake of brown water, turned into a raging torrent. Elias went down to the banks to secure the family's mule, which had panicked in the rising water. Margaret watched him go from the porch. She watched him step into the mud. She saw the bank give way. She didn't scream. The river simply swallowed him. One moment he was there, a man of flesh and blood, and the next, there was only the brown, churning water. They didn't find Elias for 3 weeks. When they did, he was miles downstream, tangled in the roots of a sycamore tree. Coroner advised a closed casket. Margaret refused. She looked at what the water had done to her husband, and something inside her, some delicate, structural strut of her sanity, snapped. But it didn't break loudly. It broke quietly. At the funeral, the townspeople whispered. They expected tears. They expected Margaret to throw herself on the pine box. Instead, she stood like a statue carved from grey granite. Her 5 sons stood beside her, arranged by height. Silas, the eldest at 23, looked terrified, his eyes red from weeping. Ephraim, Jude, and Levi shifted uncomfortably in their scratchy Sunday suits. And little Arthur, only 9 years old, held his mother's hand so tightly his knuckles were white. Margaret didn't look at the grave. She looked at the horizon. She looked at the sky with an expression of cold, calculating judgment. In the weeks that followed, the neighbors tried to do what mountain folks always do. They brought food. They brought casseroles, cornbread, jars of pickled beans. They walked up the steep road to the ridge, expecting to sit on the porch and swap stories about Elias. But the reception they got was chilling. Clara Hayes, a woman who had lived in the Hollow for 40 years, wrote about it in her diary. She described walking up to the Vance cabin on a Tuesday afternoon. The house was silent. No smoke rose from the chimney, even though it was a damp day. Clara knocked. It took a long time for the door to open. When it did, Margaret blocked the entrance. She was wearing black, her hair pulled back so tightly it pulled the skin of her forehead taut. Clara tried to look past her. The inside of the cabin was dark, the curtains drawn. But Clara's eyes adjusted, and she saw them. The 5 boys. They were sitting at the long dining table. They weren't eating. They weren't talking. They weren't whittling wood or mending tools. They were just sitting, hands folded on the table, eyes fixed on their mother's back, waiting. It was the stillness that frightened Clara. It wasn't the stillness of discipline. It was the stillness of fear. It was the stillness of prey, hoping not to be noticed. Margaret took the food Clara offered. She didn't smile. She didn't say thank you. She simply said, "The Lord gives, and the Lord takes, Clara. We are learning not to want what He hasn't given." She closed the door before Clara could ask what that meant. Clara walked back down the hill, and she told her husband that night that the Vance house felt like a tomb that hadn't been sealed yet. By the summer of 1921, 2 years after the death of Elias, the erosion of normalcy was complete. The Vance family had effectively vanished from the social fabric of Pike County. In the beginning, Silas, the eldest son, would still come to town. He was the lifeline. Every 2 weeks, he would lead the mule down the ridge to Virgil Cass's general store. He would buy flour, salt, sugar, and nails. Silas was a strong young man, built like his father. But during those trips in early 1921, people noticed he was shrinking. His clothes hung loose on his frame. His eyes, once bright and flirtatious with the girls in town, were now darting and paranoid. He spoke in whispers. When asked how his mother was, he would recite the same phrase, mechanical and rehearsed. "Mother is preparing us. Mother is well." Then, in June of 1921, Silas stopped coming. The summer heat settled over the mountains, thick and oppressive. The credit tab at the general store grew. Virgil Cass was a businessman, but he wasn't heartless. He let the debt ride for a month, then 2. But by late July, he needed answers. He called his nephew, a 17-year-old boy named Coulter, and told him to hike up the ridge. "Just see if they're sick," Virgil said, "and if they ain't sick, tell 'em I can't carry this debt forever." Coulter was a mountain kid. He wasn't afraid of bears or snakes, but he was afraid of the Vance Ridge. He'd heard the whispers. He'd heard the loggers talking about the lights in the woods, but he went. He hiked the 7 miles up the logging road, sweating through his shirt. When Coulter reached the gate of the Vance property, the silence hit him. It was midday, the time when cicadas should be screaming in the trees, but the air was dead. The cabin looked neglected. Weeds were growing up through the porch slats. The windows were dark, like eyes that had been gouged out. Coulter didn't make it to the porch. Margaret met him at the gate. She moved silently, stepping out of the tall grass like a ghost. She looked older than 43. Her skin was papery, translucent. Her hands were covered in bandages. Coulter stammered his message about the debt. He tried to look tough, tried to be the debt collector his uncle wanted him to be. Margaret didn't get angry. She didn't argue. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. She dropped it into Coulter's hand. It was heavy. Coulter opened it and saw silver dollars, dozens of them, but they weren't shiny. They were black with tarnish. They were cold, ice cold, and they smelled of damp earth. It was money that had been buried in a jar underground for a very long time. "Tell your uncle we are paid in full," Margaret said. Her voice was soft, almost musical, which made it all the more terrifying. "Tell him not to send anyone else. We have everything we need." Coulter nodded, backing away. He wanted to leave, but he saw movement in the upstairs window. He looked up. It was Silas. His face was pressed against the glass. He looked skeletal. His mouth was open in a silent scream, or maybe a warning. But then Margaret's hand appeared on the glass and pulled the curtain shut. Coulter looked back at Margaret. She was smiling now. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the smile of a shark that has just found blood in the water. "Silas is busy," she said, answering the question Coulter hadn't dared to ask. "He is building a cathedral in his heart. It takes a lot of focus to build a cathedral, boy. You have to clear out all the rubble first." Coulter turned and ran. He didn't stop running until he reached the main road. He told his uncle about the money. He told him about the silver that smelled of the grave, but he didn't tell him about Silas's face. He kept that nightmare to himself. As autumn approached, the darkness on the ridge deepened. The logging crews working the adjacent slopes began to report things that defied explanation. These were hard men, men who drank moonshine and fought with knives, not men prone to flights of fancy. But they all agreed on one thing: the smoke. At 3 in the morning, every morning, thick, black smoke would pour from the Vance chimney. It wasn't the grey smoke of oak or pine. It was heavy, greasy smoke, and the smell that drifted down into the valley was nauseating. It smelled like burning hair. It smelled like spoiled meat being scorched to ash. And then there was the singing. Jackson Thorne, the foreman of the logging crew, was a skeptic. He didn't believe in haints. But one night in October, when the moon was full and bright, he walked up to the property line to settle the men's nerves. He wanted to prove there was nothing to be afraid of. He crept through the underbrush, careful not to make a sound. He reached the edge of the clearing and looked towards the cabin. What he saw froze the blood in his veins. The 5 Vance boys were in the yard. The temperature was dropping toward freezing, frost forming on the grass. But the boys were shirtless. They were barefoot. Their ribs stood out against their skin like the rungs of a ladder. They were standing in a perfect circle, facing inward. Their heads were bowed so low their chins touched their chests. They were shivering violently, their bodies convulsing with the cold, but they didn't move their feet. They were rooted to the spot. In the center of the circle stood Margaret. She was wearing a heavy wool coat, holding a lantern in one hand and a Bible in the other. She was walking around the inside of the circle, whispering into the ears of her freezing sons. Thorne couldn't hear the words, but he heard the tone. It was the tone of a hypnotist, relentless, rhythmic. Suddenly, Margaret stopped. She stiffened. She turned her head slowly toward the dark tree line where Thorne was hiding. She couldn't have seen him. It was too dark, but she looked right at him. "The witness is here," she shouted. Her voice cracked across the clearing like a whip. In unison, all 5 boys snapped their heads up. They looked at the trees. Their eyes were wide, rolling in their heads. They looked like animals caught in a trap. Thorn didn't wait to see what would happen next. He scrambled back down the slope, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He told his men to pack up the camp that night. They left the timber where it lay. They abandoned the job. Thorn told the company that the terrain was too unstable, that it wasn't safe. But the truth was, he knew that something on that ridge had gone feral. He knew that the Vance family had seceded from the human race and established their own dark nation up in the trees. By November, the isolation was absolute. The leaves fell, stripping the mountain bare, leaving the cabin exposed like a gray bone on the hillside. The town of Pikeville turned its back. It was easier to ignore the ridge than to confront it. They told themselves that grief does strange things to people. They told themselves that the Vances just wanted to be left alone. But ignoring a fire doesn't put it out. It just lets it burn down into the roots. And up in the cabin, the fire of Margaret's delusion was consuming the oxygen, consuming the food, and soon it would begin to consume the flesh. The last person to try to save them was a man of God. But even God has trouble getting through a locked door when the devil is holding the key. Father Black rode his horse up the mountain in early December, carrying a Bible and a naive belief in the power of prayer. He didn't know that he was riding into a theological slaughterhouse. He didn't know that Margaret Vance had rewritten the Bible, and in her version, salvation didn't come from bread and wine. It came from hunger. December in Appalachia is not a season, it is a sentence. The mountains turn into a monochrome cage of gray sky and black timber. The wind doesn't just blow, it screams through the gaps in the valleys, carrying sleet that cuts like glass. In 1921, the winter came early and hard, sealing the higher elevations in a tomb of ice. Father Black was not a local man. He was a circuit rider, an itinerant preacher who moved from town to town, trading sermons for a hot meal and a place to sleep. He was a man of genuine faith, but perhaps a bit naive about the darker corners of human nature. He had heard the whispers in Pikeville, the stories of the mad widow and her ghost sons. To Father Black, this sounded like a challenge. It sounded like a soul in distress, crying out for shepherding. He rode his horse, a sturdy roan named Gideon, up the logging road on the first Tuesday of December. The snow was already ankle-deep, and the horse snorted clouds of steam into the frigid air. As he climbed, the silence that Robert Miller would describe 80 years later began to settle over the woods. It was an unnatural quiet, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for violence. When the cabin came into view, Father Black shivered, and not just from the cold. The place looked abandoned. No smoke rose from the chimney. The windows were dark, but the path to the front door was swept clean of snow. Someone was still here. Someone was maintaining order amidst the desolation. He dismounted and tied Gideon to the porch rail. He climbed the steps, the wood groaning under his weight, and knocked firmly on the heavy oak door. "Mrs. Vance," he called out, "I am Father Black. I come with the word of God and a desire to pray with you." Silence. He knocked again, louder this time. "Mrs. Vance, are the boys well?" From inside the house, he heard a sound. It was the sound of heavy furniture being dragged across the floor. A scraping, grinding noise. Then, the slide of a heavy bolt. The door opened, but only a crack. A single chain lock kept it from swinging wide. Through the gap, a slice of a face appeared. It was Margaret. But it wasn't the Margaret the town remembered. She was skeletal. Her skin was pulled so tight over her cheekbones it looked ready to tear. Her hair was a wild, grey mane. But her eyes were electric. They burned with a terrifying, feverish clarity. "We have no need of new words, Father," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, dry as old paper. "We have found the old words, the true words." Father Black leaned in, trying to see past her into the gloom of the cabin. The smell wafting out was overpowering, a mix of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and that sweet, cloying scent of sickness. "Margaret," he said gently, "the town is worried. They say Silas hasn't been seen. They say the little one, Arthur, is gone. Let me see the boys. Let me bring you some food." At the word food, Margaret's eyes narrowed. she hissed, a sound like a snake striking. Food, she spat. Food is the anchor, Father. It is the chain that binds the spirit to the mud. We are breaking the chain. We are learning to float. Starvation is not holiness, Margaret, Father Black said, his voice hardening. It is suicide. It is a sin. Margaret laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. You think this is starvation? No. This is emptying the vessel. How can God fill us if we are full of bread and meat? We must be hollow. We must be clean. Suddenly, from the darkness behind her, a voice called out. It was high, thin, and trembling. Mama, I'm cold. It was Arthur, the 9-year-old. Father Black pushed against the door. Let me in, Margaret. That boy needs help. Margaret's face twisted into a mask of fury. She slammed her shoulder against the door, trying to shut it. He is weak, she screamed. The cold is the devil trying to get back in. He must burn it out with prayer. She managed to force the door shut. Father Black heard the bolt slide home. He pounded on the wood, he shouted, he pleaded, but the only answer was the sound of Margaret's voice, singing that low, monotonous melody, drowning out the soft whimpering of her son. Father Black stood on the porch for 10 minutes, defeated. He knew that if he tried to break the door down, she might do something drastic. He retreated. He rode back to town and went straight to the sheriff. But the law in 1921 was a blunt instrument. Sheriff Harlan Crow listened, chewed his tobacco, and shook his head. Can't kick in a door because a woman's got religion, preacher, Crow said. Unless you saw a crime, unless you saw blood, it's her house, her kids. Father Black left town the next day. He wrote in his journal that he felt he had looked into the mouth of hell, and hell wasn't fire and brimstone. It was a cold cabin on a ridge, and a mother who loved her children to death. The snows came in earnest that night. The passes closed. The ridge was cut off from the world. For 4 months, the Vance cabin became a sealed ecosystem, a terrifying microcosm of Margaret's madness. What happened inside those walls during the long, dark months of January, February, and March would only be pieced together later through the forensic evidence of the dead and the frantic scrawlings in the journals. Inside the cabin, time had stopped. Margaret had covered the windows with heavy blankets. Day and night were irrelevant. There was only the work. The work was purification. Margaret had convinced herself, and through sheer force of will, her sons, that they were the last remnants of a pure bloodline chosen by God to rebuild Eden. But to enter Eden, they had to shed the corruption of the modern world. And the primary corruption was hunger. She began by rationing a loaf of bread for 6 people, then half a loaf, then a single slice. By January, the food was gone. But Margaret didn't panic. She celebrated. She told them that the hunger pangs were not pain. They were the sensation of sin leaving the body. Do you feel it gnawing? She would ask them as they sat shivering at the empty table. That is the beast dying. Let it die. The journals, written in Margaret's increasingly jagged handwriting, document the descent. Asterisk, January 12th. Asterisk, Silas is resisting. He tried to open the root cellar today. He claimed he heard the potatoes calling him. The devil speaks in the voice of vegetables. I had to bind his hands. He cried, but it was the cry of a demon leaving a man. Asterisk, January 24th. Asterisk, Ephraim and Jude are quiet now. Good boys. They sit for hours without moving. They are becoming like the angels. Translucent. I can almost see the light shining through their skin. Asterisk, February 3rd. Asterisk, Arthur stopped asking for food. He just sleeps. He sleeps so much. I told him that in his dreams he is feasting on the word of God. But biology is cruel. It does not care about theology. As the boys weakened, their minds began to break. Hallucinations set in. The cabin became a house of horrors, not just physically, but psychically. They saw food that wasn't there. They saw feasts on the table. Silas, the strongest, broke his restraints in a delirium. He didn't try to attack his mother. He attacked the woodpile. He began chewing on the bark of the logs, desperate for anything to fill his stomach. Margaret saw this not as desperation, but as a failure of faith. In her mind, Silas was letting the beast win. The journals stopped being specific here, perhaps because even Margaret couldn't write down what she did next. But the forensic evidence speaks louder than words. Silas was found with blunt force trauma to the back of his skull. He hadn't fallen. He had been struck, hard, a mercy killing, in her eyes, a way to stop him from debasing himself. With the disruptive element gone, the ritual deepened. Margaret moved the remaining sons into the cellar. She told them it was a womb, a place to be reborn. It was cold, damp, and pitch black. She locked them in. She would sit at the top of the stairs and read scripture to them through the door. Levi and Arthur, the youngest, huddled together for warmth. Jude and Ephraim, older and more indoctrinated, sat apart, meditating on their hunger, waiting for the transcendence their mother promised. They waited for wings to sprout. They waited for the light. But only the cold came. By March, the silence in the cellar was absolute. Margaret, alone in the house above, believed she had succeeded. She stopped drinking water herself. She spent her days carving prayers into the walls of the cabin with a paring knife. She carved until her fingers bled, until the wood was scarred with her madness. The vessel is clean, she carved. The blood is pure. Winter finally broke in April. The sun returned. The ice melted, turning the roads into rivers of mud. The world woke up, but the Vance cabin did not. Sheriff Harlan Crow was a man who trusted his gut, and his gut had been twisting all winter. The preacher's visit had spooked him more than he admitted. On the first Tuesday of April, when the road was passable, he saddled his horse. He took 2 deputies, Ross and Caleb. They brought shovels. They didn't say why, but they knew. The ride up was slow. The forest was waking up buds on the trees, birds calling. But as they neared the ridge, the silence returned. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. They found the front door wide open. It swung on its hinges, creaking in the gentle breeze. It was an invitation to a nightmare. Crow drew his revolver. "Sheriff's Department," he called out. No answer. He stepped onto the porch. The smell hit him instantly. It was the smell of a butcher shop that had been left in the sun. He pulled his bandana over his nose and stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was a chaotic testament to insanity. The walls were covered in the carvings, thousands of words scratched into every surface. The furniture was overturned, and in the center of the room, the floorboards had been ripped up, exposing the dirt beneath, as if someone had been digging for something that wasn't there. "Check the back," Crow ordered, his voice muffled by the bandana. Deputy Ross went to the bedroom. "Empty, Sheriff. But, Jesus, look at the walls." The bedroom walls were covered in tally marks. Days, weeks, counting down to nothing. Crow moved to the cellar door. The padlock was hanging open. He lifted the heavy hatch. The smell billowed up, thick and visible in the shafts of sunlight. Crow gagged but forced himself to descend. He clicked on his flashlight. The beam swept over the canning shelves, empty. It swept over the dirt floor, and then it landed on the corner. "Oh God," Crow whispered. There were 2 bodies, small, curled together, Levi and Arthur. They didn't look like people anymore. They looked like dried leaves. They were mummified by the cold and the dry air of the cellar. They were holding hands. But it wasn't just the bodies that stopped Crow's heart. It was the scene. Around the bodies, someone had arranged a circle of candles. They were burnt down to nubs, and in the dust of the floor, perfectly legible, was a message written by a finger dipped in soot. Asterisk, "Mother says we are clean now." Asterisk, Crow backed up the stairs, his legs shaking. He got to the porch and threw up over the rail. Ross and Caleb were pale, staring at the woods. "Where is she?" Caleb asked. "Where's the widow?" Crow wiped his mouth. He looked toward the creek. "She'll be washing," he said, a sudden intuition hitting him. "She'll be trying to get clean." They found her half a mile downstream. Margaret Vance was kneeling on a flat rock in the middle of the creek. The water was freezing, snow melt running fast and clear. She was wearing a white nightgown, stained yellow and brown. She was scrubbing her arms. She was scrubbing them so hard the skin was gone, the red meat exposed to the air. She didn't hear them approach. She was humming. That same low, steady tune. Crow holstered his gun. He didn't need it. He waded into the water. "Margaret," he said softly. She stopped scrubbing. She looked up. Her face was a skull, but her eyes were bright, filled with a terrifying, beatific peace. She smiled at the sheriff. "Look, Harlan," she said, holding up her bleeding arms. "I finally got the stains out." "Where are the others, Margaret?" Crow asked, his voice breaking. "Where are Silas and the older boys?" She pointed to the sky. Then she pointed to the earth behind the cabin. "They are seeds, Harlan. I planted them. They will grow into trees of righteousness." They found the other 3 bodies that afternoon, buried in shallow graves. Silas, with his skull crushed. Ephraim and Jude, bound and starved. Margaret Vance was led away in handcuffs, still humming. She never shed a tear. She never showed remorse. As they put her in the back of the wagon, she looked back at the cabin, the empty, carved-up shell of her life, and she said one last thing to the sheriff. "Don't you see?" she whispered. "They never have to be hungry again. I saved them from the world." The horror of the discovery was enough to scar the town for a generation. But the true horror, the lingering poison of the Vance tragedy, wasn't in the bodies. It was in the journals that Robert Miller would find 80 years later. Because the journals proved that Margaret wasn't just crazy. They proved that she was methodical. They proved that she had a plan. And the scariest part was that, in her own twisted logic, the plan had worked. Here is the final *** part, 3** of the script. This part focuses on the aftermath, the disturbing contents of the journals found in 2003, and the lasting legacy of the tragedy. There are some stains that no amount of scrubbing can remove. Some events are so heavy that they crack the foundation of a place, leaving a fissure that leaks darkness forever. The arrest of Margaret Vance in April of 1922 was the end of the family, but it was the beginning of the legend. Margaret didn't last long in captivity. They placed her in a cell in the basement of the Pike County courthouse. She refused a lawyer. She refused a priest. Most importantly, she refused food. The sheriff tried to force-feed her broth, but she clamped her jaw shut with the strength of a bear trap. She sat on the edge of her cot, hands folded in her lap, staring at the stone wall. The guards said she didn't sleep. Every time they walked past her cell, day or night, her eyes were open. She died on May 2nd, 1922, less than a month after being found. The official cause of death was self-imposed starvation. But the coroner noted something else in his report, a detail that was kept out of the newspapers. He noted that Margaret's face, in death, was not peaceful. It was frozen in a mask of absolute terror. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, her eyes wide and fixed on the corner of the ceiling. It was as if, in the final moment, the veil had lifted, as if she had finally seen where she was actually going, and it wasn't the paradise she had promised her sons. The town of Pikeville wanted to forget. They buried the 5 sons in the church cemetery, but they put them in the pauper's corner, near the fence line. There were no headstones, just wooden crosses that rotted away within a decade. Margaret was buried outside the consecrated ground, in a plot of weeds near the river. No one attended the burial except the gravediggers and Sheriff Crow. Crow stood over the grave for a long time, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Damn you, Margaret," he whispered. "Damn you for making sense." That was the thing that haunted Crow until his own death in 1940. It wasn't the violence, it was the logic. When he interrogated her in those first few days, she hadn't spoken in gibberish. She had spoken with a terrifying clarity. She explained that the world was a machine designed to crush the soul. That hunger, desire, and fear were the gears of that machine. By removing those things, by removing the capacity to want, she believed she was breaking the machine. "I am not a murderer, Sheriff," she had told him. "I am a liberator." The cabin was burned to the ground in the summer of 1922. It wasn't an official demolition. A group of locals, men who had lost sleep thinking about what happened in that cellar, went up the ridge with kerosene and torches. They watched it burn. They watched the roof collapse. They watched the smoke rise, black and oily, just like the smoke that had plagued the valley all winter. They thought fire would cleanse the land. They were wrong. The stone foundation survived the fire. The cellar survived. The earth simply swallowed them up, hiding them under vines and leaves, waiting for Robert Miller to stumble upon them 80 years later. When Miller handed the journals over to the Historical Society in 2003, he didn't know he was handing them a bomb. The society was thrilled at first, a primary source document from the mysterious Vance tragedy. But as the archivists began to transcribe the water-damaged pages, the thrill turned to nausea. The journals weren't just a record of starvation, they were a manual. The first journal, dated 1920, was mundane. Recipes, weather reports, grief over Elias. But the second journal, starting in 1921, documented the shift. Margaret began writing about the voice. She didn't call it God, she called it the architect. She wrote that the architect had shown her the blueprints of a new human being, one that didn't need food, one that didn't feel pain. Asterisk. Entry, the 14th of September 1921. Asterisk. The architect showed me the boys today as they truly are. Not flesh, but light trapped in mud. The mud is heavy. The mud is hungry. I must scrape the mud away so the light can get out. Silas is the muddiest. He clings to the earth. I must scrub him harder. The third journal, the one found with Jude's body, was the most harrowing. It contained the daily logs of the treatment. Margaret had conducted experiments. She would deprive them of sleep for days to see if they could dream while awake. She would expose them to extreme cold to freeze the sin out of the blood. But the most disturbing entries were the ones written by the boys themselves. Margaret had forced them to write confessions, pages and pages of childish handwriting, shaky and weak. Asterisk Arthur, age 9. Asterisk, I am sorry I cried for bread. Bread is a trick. I want to be light. Mama says if I am quiet, I will float. Asterisk Levi, age 12. Asterisk, my stomach hurts but Mama says it is just the devil. Leaving. I saw Daddy yesterday. He was standing in the corner. He didn't have a face. He told me to listen to Mama. The historians who read these journals were sworn to secrecy. The county decided that the contents were too disturbing for the public. The journals were catalogued as restricted, sensitive genealogical material and locked in a vault in the state archives in Frankfurt. They remain there today. You cannot check them out. You cannot photograph them. But secrets have a way of leaking. One of the archivists, a woman named Sarah, gave an anonymous interview to a folklore blog in 2010. She said that reading Margaret's handwriting felt like touching a live wire. She said that for weeks after reading them, she couldn't eat. She would look at food and see mud. She said the madness in those pages was contagious. And then there was the doll. The faceless, burned wooden doll found by Miller. It sits in a storage box in the basement of the local museum. It has never been put on display. The curator claims it's because of preservation concerns. But the janitorial staff tells a different story. They say that when you are in the basement alone, you get the feeling that something is watching you. They say that sometimes the doll moves, not much, just a shift in position, a turn of the head, as if it's looking for the fire that burned its face off. Robert Miller, the surveyor, never went back to the woods. He quit his job a month after the discovery. He moved to Ohio, to a city far away from the silence of the mountains. He told his wife that he couldn't stand the sound of the wind in the trees anymore. He said it sounded like humming, like a woman humming a lullaby to a child who was already dead. Today, Blackwood Ridge is part of the protected state forest. There are no trails that lead to the Vance site. It is officially designated as a wildlife sanctuary, a convenient excuse to keep hikers away. But teenagers, being teenagers, still try to find it. Every Halloween, a few brave souls bushwhack up the ridge looking for the ghost cabin. Most of them find nothing, just trees and rocks. But every few years, someone comes back with a story. They talk about the compass spinning wildly. They talk about the sudden drop in temperature. And they talk about the silence. The kind of silence that hurts your ears. In 2018, a YouTuber from Lexington tried to camp on the ridge for a paranormal investigation. He set up cameras and audio recorders. He planned to stay 3 nights. He lasted 1. He hiked down at dawn, leaving his tent behind. He uploaded a video a week later. He looked haggard, pale. He played an audio clip he had recorded at 3 a.m. The clip was mostly static, the sound of wind. But then, buried in the white noise, there was a voice. It wasn't a ghost. It sounded unnervingly human. A woman's voice, clear and sharp. "The vessel is almost clean," she whispered. And then, a child's voice, answering, "Yes, Mama." The video went viral for a week, then was deleted. The YouTuber deleted his entire channel and vanished from social media. The legacy of the Vance family is not just a ghost story. It is a warning. It is a reminder of what happens when faith is severed from reality, when love is twisted by isolation until it becomes a weapon. Margaret Vance believed she was building a cathedral. Instead, she dug a grave. But perhaps the most terrifying thought is this: Margaret died believing she was right. She died believing she had won. She looked at the sheriff with pity because she truly believed that her sons were safe, pure, and eternal. And if you walk up Blackwood Ridge today, and you stand in that clearing where the foundation stones still sink into the earth, you might feel it too. You might feel the pull of that terrible logic, the desire to stop struggling, the desire to just lay down in the dark, close your eyes, and let the world fade away until you are clean, until you are empty, until you are nothing but light trapped in mud. This is the story of the Vance family, a story that the mountains have tried to swallow, but the throat of the earth is not wide enough to choke it down. It remains, it waits, and it hums. Thank you for listening. If this story unsettled you, if you felt the cold of that cellar even for a second, leave a comment below. Tell us, do you believe that places can hold on to memories? Or do we just project our fears onto the empty spaces? Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are thousands of ridges in Appalachia, and every single one of them has a secret. Sleep well.